Behind. I want to come back to the first question in this group about cultural relativism, because I think the real issue here is not whether there are different, everybody knows that there are different cultures. I think the real question is whether you can regard these differences within a framework of progress, in the sense that some cultures or features of culture are better than others. I mean, the real question of cultural relativism is one whether you think progress implies, as you said, an underlying innate sense, for instance, a sense of justice, or whether these cultural choices are wholly arbitrary, with none being better than it. But I mean, that's the real issue with cultural relativism.
But whatever you believe about that, there is a fixed basis. There must be a fixed basis. Otherwise, you can't acquire a culture in the first place. And that fixed basis has to be determinative, narrowly determinative. Now, that fixed basis gives our actual human moral values. Now, if you raise the question about progress, yeah, I think there is progress. And I think it's valuable to look at our own history. So we're not talking about imperialist conquest. Our own history shows that there is moral progress. And in fact, the very examples that were given strongly illustrated slavery, subjugation of women, repression of homosexuals. All of this was very common, perfectly well accepted in Western culture, not very far back. In the case of, say, Turing, it was 50 years ago. It's now all regarded as completely unacceptable. I think that's evidence. You know, it's not in discussing human affairs. You don't have proofs. We don't understand enough. But I think this is, and there's much more like it, is evidence that somehow, as our own history, culture develops, we penetrate more deeply into our actual, real cultural and normative values. And we expand the moral sphere in fairly definite ways. These three examples are good illustrations of it. There are plenty like it.
I would like to respond to that, because you see, this is exactly what you're expressing there is exactly the point of view of the Enlightenment, which is so rejected nowadays in the name of other cultures. Because if you speak of progress without our own cultures, and you say this took a long time, etc., and now we look at it as a progress, but when you encounter other cultures that have not undergone this so-called progress, they will reply to you that your progress is actually a regression. Let me give you an example. Take homosexuality. Suppose there is a sacred book, a religious book, that says that this is a sin. If you allow that sin, the community will be destroyed, partly because to allow that sin is to allow for unreligious behavior and to allow for skepticism. And if skepticism spreads, then the religious culture is going to be destroyed. I have seen that in my own country, in my own life, with the Catholic culture. Now we're going to, yeah, I know. But suppose a Muslim doesn't want to see their culture going the same way the Catholic has in this country, or the Jews, or some other sort of more traditional community, or the Catholic, whatever remains of them. I mean, you see, what do you say to them? You say your whole culture should go because homosexuality should be free?
No, in fact, I say the same thing in my own culture. It's a sin in Jewish culture.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, but
then don't you think
it's a sin in Jewish culture. I wouldn't have asked some Nazi to come along and force it to be abandoned. No. But I think that in the course of time, in the course of thinking through your own values, these things are overcome. Our own culture is a good example. Homosexuality was considered not a sin, it was considered a pathology, a sickness. Okay, and that's recent. We've come to understand it's not a sickness. And in fact, the idea that it was, and that you should kill people.
Yeah, I know. But you think this understanding is potentially universal, so it's apply all cultures?
I think it's potentially universal, and I think there are good reasons to believe it. Because even if you're the most extreme moral relativist, you are presupposing universal moral values. And those can be discovered. In fact, in recent years, there's even empirical work trying to investigate them cross-culturally with children and so on. It's basically a scientific question. And we know that we have good reason to expect that there's going to be an answer. Part of the reason is just almost logic. You can't acquire a culture without having a rich, built-in array of constraints that allow the leap from scattered data to whatever it is that you acquire. I mean, that's virtually logic. And I think a look at our own history gives good illustrations. For example, looking at just the very examples that are given here, it's been a long battle, but over time, in fact, the last couple of centuries, there's been a very consistent change. And the change is not without conflict, but it's going in a particular direction. And I think you can even understand the direction. The direction is towards more tolerance of variation and more opposition to coercion and control. I think that's a very definite tendency. And I think it suggests something pretty strong about what our fundamental moral values are.
Okay, Norman has a little question.
A very quick question with a quick answer, because time goes by very fast, but you've developed this idea of expanding moral sphere, and I think it's a crucial and important idea. And I would like to hear you talk about those folks that say today that it should expand to animals now.
Yeah, that's a perfectly good example, in fact. The issue of animal rights, not very long ago, that was considered totally absurd. So in the sciences, for example, if you want to do animal experimentation, you can do anything you like. Well, that's gone. Say where I live, Cambridge, Massachusetts, there are very strict rules on what animal experimenters can do. Brutality towards animals, sheer brutality is just not accepted anymore. It's understood to be wrong. That's another expansion of the moral sphere. My own guess is that sometime in the future, humans will all be vegetarians, because I'm not. But I think we can look forward to a time where the moral sphere will have extended to the recognition that the torture of animals is just illegitimate.
Okay, now we're going on to the third segment of questions that are a little shorter, and maybe the answers can be a little shorter too because time passes. Okay, Jean?
Well, I can't help saying about your answer to the last question, that what you call virtual logic about the acquisition of culture is constantly denied by almost everybody who studies cultures.
It's also denied by everyone who works on language and everything else. Yes. It's just totally irrational.
Okay. And I won't ask your view on contemporary art, even your views on creativity. So let's put that, everything aside. Okay, let's go to the next section. Okay, I know I have to move. You're very, now let's go to, now we're going to get into real disagreements. You're a very radical defender of free speech. But what about incitement to racial hatred? Do you think that this should be tolerated? Do you think that given Europe's past, one should tolerate expressions of anti-Semitism? Isn't that a form of insult of the dead? And what do you reply to those who say, never again?
Okay, my question is the following. On the one hand, you rightly insist on the importance of thought control and propaganda in our societies, and you have devoted much time analyzing it and explaining its mechanisms. But on the other hand, you often, and rightly so, point to the fact that credible surveys show that on many issues, people, for example in the United States, are nevertheless adopting positions that are miles away from the official propaganda. This, which is probably not a contradiction, is nonetheless very interesting. My question is, what should we make of it, especially as activists?
Let's start with the radical defense of freedom of speech. In Belgium, I guess, my position is considered radical. In the United States, it's considered conservative. I'm taking the position of the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, how can you be more conservative than that? One of the good things about the United States, it's my values, and I would like to hope that it will be other people's values too. Free speech is really protected. Incidentally, that's not historically true. This is another example like slavery and homosexuality and so on. There's illusions that freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution, famous First Amendment. But if you read the First Amendment, it doesn't guarantee freedom of speech. And in fact, throughout American history, it has not been interpreted as guaranteeing freedom of speech. In fact, the history of protection of freedom of speech in the United States is extremely interesting, for one reason, because it's reached the most advanced level there, and it's recent. The first, the law is basically what the courts decide, not what's written on paper. The first freedom of speech cases came to the courts in the 20th century, and the famous early judgments that people hail as great progress were dissents in the Supreme Court cases. And first of all, and secondly, they were very weak, so the dissents still permitted the kind of repression of speech that would be considered intolerable now. In fact, I won't go through the details, but it wasn't until the 1960s, which is pretty recent, that the courts reached a high standard of freedom of speech. And it's interesting to look at the cases. They're very revealing. The first case involved the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, in judging in their favor in a libel suit. The courts struck down a law that almost every country has, and that the US had, the laws of seditious libel, which make it a crime to assault the state with words, basically. That was struck down in 1964. That means it expands the notion of freedom of speech. It was defending the civil rights movement. The next major case, a couple of years later, was defending the Ku Klux Klan, the most racist, violent, murderous organization in American history. It defended them, and it established an even higher standard of freedom of speech, namely that speech should be free up to participation in imminent criminal action. So if, say, he and I go into a store and he has a gun and we intend to rob it, and I say, shoot, that's not protected. That's action and that's speech and participation in imminent criminal action. Well, that leaves a degree of latitude, but that's the basic principle. Frankly, I think that's the right principle. Actually, that's a principle that was enunciated in the Enlightenment, Jeremy Bentham and others, and it's taken a long time to reach it. In my view, that's progress. That's progress, as in the case of slavery, homosexuality, and subjugation of women. And it's virtually unique. Well, what about, I should say that this high level of protection of freedom of speech is almost universally accepted with regard to ourselves. So, for example, not far from here, there are august institutions like United Nations General Assembly and Security Council, where there's constant incitement, not just to racial hatred, but to extreme violent action based on demonization of people and cultures. In fact, there's incitement to the most extreme form of crime, namely what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime of aggression. Constant incitement to that, and demonization of those necessary to create as monsters to be destroyed. Furthermore, that same goes on in the newspapers and common current discourse and so on. And there's no effort to try to stop that.